is up to the National Executive Committee, to which I am accountable to take whatever decision. So that's all I have to say today on this matter. Any other matter on this will be communicated at a later time and stage. So I would like to appeal to you all that we leave it there. And all I'd like to hear you say, have a good afternoon, Mr. President. We'll see you around again. Thank you very much.
Well, a president under siege. As the debate rages on about the fate of President Cyril Ramaphosa and the source of the Phala Phala dollars, a question that equally rages on in various conversations is the identity and the whereabouts of the apparent Sudanese buyer, Mr. Mustafa Hazim, from whom $580 was apparently acquired for the purchase of 20 buffaloes. I'm Aldrin Simpier and this is Unfiltered. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Concerns have been raised about the potential money laundering associated with these alleged transactions, also putting the spotlight on the general vulnerability of the wildlife industry to money laundering activities. The team here at Unfiltered tried to locate Sudanese citizen Mr. Hazim. This evening, we'll share with you what our Sudanese source says about Mr. Hazim. Well, that's if he does exist. Tonight we ask you, the alleged source of the Phala Phala dollars, is it plausible? Is it plausible at all? Join this debate on Twitter and on Facebook. On Twitter, use the handle @Unfiltered SABC and search for Unfiltered SABC on Facebook. Joining me for the conversation this evening is Richard York, who's the CEO of the Wildlife Ranching South Africa and also Corruption Watch Senior Researcher Melusi Ngala. Thank you so much for making time for us this evening.
Thank you, Aldrin.
Let's start off here with this question in relation to what has happened here with Phala Phala. Ordinarily, when you want to trade in wildlife, what are some of the preconditions that you need to meet?
So all wildlife ranches are kept to a strict code. It's one of the most governed and regulated industries in South Africa. To develop a game ranch, you have to register yourself for a certificate of adequate enclosure, or P3 exemption, as commonly known in some provinces. And then you can trade with wildlife. But even if you want to trade with that wildlife, you still have to have the necessary permits to move wildlife between provinces and to translocate them. And depending on the scarcity of those wildlife, you've also got various legislations that are also applicable.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of those legislation?
So you've got what we call, in terms of registration in South Africa, you've got international legislation, that's CITES, the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species, or Fauna and Flora. You've got your national legislation such as NEMBA and NEMA, which is the National Environmental Management Act and the National Environmental Biodiversities Act. And then you've also got your TOPS legislation. And when I say TOPS, I'm not referring to your local liquor store. I'm talking about your threatened or protected species regulations.
Yeah.
Those are just some of your legislations. And then what you also have on top of it is you've got the 9+1 legislation. So in other words, every single province that you want to do business in, you've got to have effectively a driver's license.
Yeah.
And all the legislation that I've discussed so far is only to do with the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fishery. I haven't even touched on Department of Agriculture, Department of Veterinary Health, Department of Tourism, or even the South African Revenue Service.
So does the person who is trading in wildlife have to be registered with CITES at all?
No.
Okay.
No, how CITES works, and I've just come back from COP19 in Panama. You've got our scientific management authorities. South Africa has 10. We've got our national management authorities, as well as we've got our 9 provincial management authorities. And it also depends, is this animal listed as Appendix 1 or Appendix 2 to be on CITES?
Mm-hmm. And Appendix 3, does that acquire, is there a prerequisite to that at all?
So Appendix 3 is a voluntary registration.
Yeah.
That's where a country puts a listing itself. And yes, that will, depending on whether the country wants Appendix 3 or not.
Okay. So we have tried to reach out to one of our sources in Sudan, trying to locate this Mr. Mustafa or Hazim, who made the purchase of the 20 buffalo, $580, according to the president, that was paid. Ordinarily, what would the steps be involved in that transaction of that nature?
Okay, so if we specifically referring to buffalo,
yeah.
It also depends, is the buyer a local buyer? Is he moving the animals to another province? You get some buyers that are willing to just be investors, that don't mind those animals being kept on your property. If it's an animal that's going out of the country, you've then got to do exports and imports, which takes a much longer process. But buffalo, normally, we've just recently moved 20 buffalo from one farm that's 30 kilometers away from our current property. It took us 3 months of permitting requirements. They first had to be darted because they needed to be tested for TB, which is tuberculosis, brucellosis, foot and mouth disease, and corridor. So buffalo in South Africa, especially your buffalo in the south of South Africa, are what we call disease-free buffalo. So that's what gives them a value, is because they can go anywhere in the world because they're free of disease. And that's what creates the high demand for them. And to move those buffalo, you have to be regulated and they have to be tested before they even moved.
Yep.
So that's what the delay in the process is.
So there's that delay in the process. However, though, what would be the initial steps that need to be taken if you want to go and, let's say you want to go and buy 20 buffalo on a farm here in South Africa?
So initial steps is you'd want to identify someone with quality animals. For me, myself, we've been breeding with buffalo for the last 10 years, and I can assure you we're nowhere close to the quality of the buffalo on Phala Phala. They're in a different league, and the way that they've been managed is in a much higher quality than most game ranches. So that's your type of what we'll call stud animals, whereas we ourselves, in my personal capacity, are more commercial farmers with buffalo. So it depends on the bloodline, where the animals come from, what the genetic quality is. It depends, are you interested in the hunting market? Are you interested in the breeding market? What's your end game? Do you want to sell breeding stock to other game ranchers, or would you like to just go into the tourism market? So there's a lot of factors that come into play. And each one of those factors have got its own individual price associated.
Yeah. So again, the source that we spoke to said to us that this Mr. Mustafa, according to their records, doesn't exist at all. Do you know whether there is an international requirement, though, that when you are a buyer who is from a foreign country, like outside of South Africa, that you too would need to be a registered permit holder?
I'm not sure. That would be dependent on that country itself. I'll also be speaking quite frankly in terms of exports, imports. We don't directly delve in that, but you do register your game farm specifically. So you are registered with your department, or you're registered with the national authority.
Is the industry volatile to money laundering at all?
Absolutely not. I'm not aware of any such cases. To explain the industry itself, when we talk about the wildlife ranching industry, we're talking about a 30 billion rand industry that creates 418,000 jobs. So it's easy to speculate about money laundering, but we've never had a single case of money laundering, and we've never had a single person ever come to us and say, here's facts leading to, or speculative facts of money laundering.
So you've never had any of those cases?
No.
Okay. Babungala, thank you so much for making time for us this evening. Is this a question that Corruption Watch has looked into, the question around money laundering within the wildlife industry?
No, not per se. It's not something that an area of our expertise, but we do have our team of lawyers do look at issues of money laundering, understanding illicit financial flows, how they work, and it's a complex area of South African law, and also a speciality in terms of the corruption work that we do. It's quite sophisticated. It involves networks, multinational companies at times, because it cuts across borders. It also involves dubious lawyers and accountants who find loopholes in legislation to say, how do we actually make this possible? You know, for example, you find a simple example would be maybe a person making several deposits of 90,000 rand, so that they don't surpass the threshold of 100,000. And of course, it takes a particular skill set or mechanism to be able to trigger that and say what's actually going on in terms of pattern here. So it is an area that we have studied before and have looked at, and something that concerns us, but not specifically with regards to wildlife.
Yeah. Have there been any complaints that have come your way, though, when it comes to corruption within the wildlife sector?
I mean, you know, the type of corruption issues that we often find relate to socioeconomic rights issues, human rights issues per se. I mean, we can make linkages between corruption and those issues, so housing, land, and so on and so forth. But in relation to business, we do have issues of fraud, people talking about money laundering and so on. So it's hard to say that, oh, specifically we have had a set of cases that relate to wildlife. We've tried to get involved in the field in terms of environmental rights to see what's actually going on there in the sector because of concerns that people might have had in terms of, regulations, how does the sector operate, what are the laws governing it, and so on and so forth.
Okay, when we come back, the question that I want to also raise as we conclude this conversation around money laundering is also whether there is a level of concern when it comes to the hard cash that some of the traders are actually by law allowed to have on their farms as well as the ranches as well. Is there something that should be looked into at all to try and deal with this issue relating to money laundering? If you've read the report, that's one of the issues that's raised in the report that says that a person who stuffs money into their sofas, certainly somebody who doesn't want to be caught, and when that money is stolen, wouldn't want to report that matter as the money is stolen because the fear of being investigated for allegations of money laundering. That conversation when we come back. And welcome back as we continue the conversation that we are currently having, focusing on the theft that happened at President Cyril Ramaphosa's farm that is in Phala Phala, and joined this evening by various guests as we have that conversation about what exactly it is that the regulations say when it comes to trading in wildlife. Richard, so the question that I have is in terms of the amount of money that you can keep on site, on your farm, your business. Do you know what the regulation says when it comes to that?
Aldrin, I'd be lying to you totally, but in terms of cash and cash coming in for sales, obviously it's legal tender. For me personally, I'd hate cash, I detest cash on the farm, and it's because it makes you and your family a vulnerable and soft target, be it burglaries, farm murders, etc. So we keep everything electronic, and should someone want to purchase wildlife from us, they're welcome to go deposit the money into our bank account.
Mm-hmm. But is it uncommon to have people who are in the wildlife trade trading in hard cash and foreign currency?
No, it's not totally uncommon. It depends where the people come from, what businesses they're from. That's something that a lot of people don't know about the wildlife sector. The wildlife sector is businessmen that are successful. It can be other trades, it can be other businesses, and they're venturing out into the wildlife industry, and the contribution that they make is astronomical. I mean, we're talking now the South African wildlife economy represents 20 million hectares. That is 1.5 times the size of England or 10 times the size of Israel, under private ownership such as Phala Phala Game Farm that's looking after endangered species.
Yeah. Babungala, is this something that you think we should be looking into, the amount of money that a wildlife trader can keep on hand on the business premise?
Yeah, definitely. I don't see why not. We shouldn't be looking into those kind of things and what measures and so on. But, some will argue that we already have existing laws to say how long you can keep a certain amount of money before declaring it, etc., etc. But in terms of wildlife itself and understanding the industry and what measures for best practice, it's definitely something that we as society, considering that we rely a lot on tourism as a sector of income and also just job opportunities, is definitely something that we need to be able to explore and see what can we do as society to make sure that transactions are legitimate, first of all, that we don't have incidents of money laundering or possible fraud or what have you.
Yeah, because there's also that issue around the illicit financial flows. Richard, another one is, so we've reached out to the Limpopo Department of economic development, environment, as well as tourism. And one thing that they tell us, the conversation that we just touched on a bit earlier on, is that there has been no application that was received from Phala Phala Wildlife nor Novemeber to export 20 buffaloes to Sudan from 2019 to date. Is that something that's peculiar at all?
No, I wouldn't say so. Because as we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, it depends where the buyer wants to keep the animals. Maybe they've purchased property in South Africa, maybe there's an agreement between them and Phala Phala to keep the animals there. There can be a lot of circumstances pertaining what the reasons are. But I do know some people that are quite close by to us. They've been trying to export buffalo now actually to the UAE, and they've been going with the process now for over 16 months. And they're still not finally there. They've still got a delayed permit application process.
And how long has that delay been for?
Well, they've been going for 16 months so far.
For 16?
And they're still busy.
They're still busy with that. Because one of the issues here that we have, that the President also highlights in his response to the panel, is around the permit process and around the process of actually exporting these animals. So how long does it normally take?
It depends where they're going to. Within Africa, at every time it varies. What's the blood work come back at? Has all the blood work been correct in the testing? Buffalo in its own right is a difficult species to move with our own legislation. I mean, we gave the example from our property 30 kilometers away to our other property. It took us 3 months. So it can vary depending on the blood tests. So unfortunately, I can't give an exact timeline on that.
Yeah, and then the process with that as well. So would a Mr. Mustafa, for instance, have informed the Department of Limpopo that I would be purchasing these buffaloes so that the process starts, or how does it work?
No, it would normally be Phala Phala doing the application or assisting in the application. So you first got to do your blood work and your testing. So it'd be interesting to know whether the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Veterinary have already processed or moved those animals. But if the animals have remained on the property, then there's no need to test them because they're already on a property which they are registered for.
Yeah. And on when Mr. Mustafa then would call and say that now I'm ready to export the animals, what would then happen?
So then the entire process would start again. You'd need to notify the department that you wish to move the animals. You'd first need to bleed the animals to make sure that they're okay with the Department of Veterinary. Once that process, which can take up to 3 months, is completed, then you go to the Department of Environment, LEDET, and you do your application to export. You've got to get an import permit from another country, wherever it's going, or another province, and then you've also got to get your permission to convey permits to come through eventually as well.
Yeah. Would all of this be happening before the money is exchanged, or?
No. You can have situations where people pay deposits and situations where people pay guarantees up front, because the process of testing the buffalo, just the initial phase, can cost up to 10,000 Rand a buffalo, which is a huge expense.
Yeah.
So if you work on 20 buffalo, that's 200,000 Rand at least that you're spending just to test whether they're clean enough to move.
Okay, we continue the conversation when we come back. Also love to hear from you, looking at your tweets as well as your Facebook posts. What do you make of the source of the Phala Phala dollars? Do you think it is plausible at all? We'd love to hear from you at Unfiltered SABC, that is on Twitter as well as Facebook. And welcome back. We're in conversation with Richard York, who is the CEO of Wildlife Ranching South Africa and also Corruption Watch Senior Researcher Melusi Ngala. Quickly, Richard, before we wrap up the conversation, when it comes to the receiver of revenue as well as the wildlife industry, what's that relationship like? But what's your obligation as an operator?
So the South African Revenue Service under Act 58 of 1962 and Section 26 of the first schedule has got a specific schedule for game farming, where that clearly indicates the obligations of the wildlife rancher, similarly to livestock such as agriculture. And the obligations that we have as a game rancher is that every year you've got to give your value of your stock when the year starts and when the year ends, indicating what your values are. So SARS considers our wildlife as biological assets that we can own. But your other departments, such as environment and agriculture, still require permits for us to move those animals. So it's quite a complex situation, but in terms of SARS, they recognize the value that the wildlife ranching sector creates and the value that there is in the ownership of game.
So you would actually have to tell SARS that this is how many buffaloes I have on the farm?
Yes.
Year in, year out?
Year in, year out.
And if they give birth, then of course you know that you add that as well. So if you had received money for buffalo that's been bought, that's still on the farm, how would you declare that?
So it depends if they've sold out of your business. So it's still your business.
Yeah.
And you could still have someone that's running animals on your property. So then it would be just declared that they're no longer in your business. You've sold them.
Okay. Mr. Ngala, just quickly then, in conclusion, one of the other elements is, at least when it comes to banks, we know the KYA, know your customer, KYC rather, know your customer. When it comes to that particular element, what would you like to see happen in the industry? This is now speaking about the wildlife industry, because seemingly from the president's response, at least, we don't know exactly who Mr. Mustafa is, still trying to locate him. But of course, he paid in cash. But is there an obligation at all for the president to know, as the owner of the farm, who he sold the buffalo to and who he received the money from?
You'd expect that at least when the purchase was made, the president would have followed all the necessary requirements. One of the issues that the panel took with what the president submitted was the receipt, which just had the name of the purchaser, but no other information, no contact information, no address, etc., etc. So all the necessary facets that were needed to actually authenticate this buyer, all that information was not there. So it's not to say that South Africa does not have measures in place, such as FICA, for example, to make sure that, you know what, or SARS as well, to make sure that the transactions are legitimate and that banks follow due process. It's just a matter of people taking advantage of the system and thinking that they can exploit loopholes that they think exist.
Yeah. Richard, just quickly, what does an invoice look like from the industry?
Just a stock forward tax invoice.
Yeah?
Yeah. If you're VAT registered, such as we are, it's a tax invoice indicating what they've purchased and for how much, with their company details on it.
With the company details on it as well?
Yeah, if they're a registered company.
And if they are not?
Then it would just be the details of the person that's purchased it.
And even though the amount would be like $580,000?
Well, I guess then they're writing off the VAT, aren't they?
Okay, thank you so much. That's Richard York, CEO of Wildlife Ranching South Africa, and also Corruption Watch Senior Researcher Melusi Ngala. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. And thank you for choosing Unfiltered with me, Aldrin St-Pierre. We're back again next week, Monday, same time, same place, right here on S3. Enjoy the rest of your evening.